Good afternoon. It's a great pleasure to see you all. It's a great pleasure to be here. That sounds like the sort of thing one is obliged to say, but it also has the virtue of being true. This still feels like home to Wendy and myself. In 1928, in August of 1928, leaders of the worldwide Adventist Church and of the European division of the General Conference of Seventh-day Adventists met at Marienhurst Seminary near Darmstadt in Germany for the division's biennial summer council. Those present included William Spicer, the General Conference president, and of course Louis Christian, who was the European division president, but it also included the presidents of 5 of the other 7 divisions and the General Conference treasurer J.L. Shaw. So that's a pretty heavyweight delegation. These leaders had gathered from around the world because the principal item on the agenda for this council was dividing the European division, which would greatly affect the world church. But in addition, there was recognition that the world church needed the church in Europe to flourish. Thus, church leaders from around the world came to Darmstadt because they wanted to help the church in Europe to grow. Within just a few days, the assembled leaders had agreed that the European division, which was supposed to direct work in the whole of Europe, most of Africa, all the Middle East, most of Central Asia and parts of North Asia, they agreed that this was simply too large. And here you see them on the 17th of August, after they'd concluded the main business and recommended that there needed to be more divisions in Europe. That recommendation went to the Autumn Council of the General Conference Executive Committee, and it was faced with increasing the number of world divisions from 8 to 11 and increasing, therefore, Europe's share in the higher councils of the church, a major impact on the church's ecclesiastical polity. But there was no hesitation because the missional logic was compelling. And so it was the 1928 Autumn Council approved the most major restructuring of the Adventist Church between 1901 and the 1970s. As a result, on the last day of 1928, the European division ceased to exist. On New Year's Day 1929, it was replaced by the Central European, Southern European, and Northern European divisions. 9 decades later, the Northern European Division, or NED, is now the Trans-European Division, or TED. It is the only division created in 1929 that has enjoyed a continuous existence ever since. Its name and territory have changed repeatedly, but the TED is an enduring feature on the ecclesiastical landscape of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. To commemorate this milestone, to reflect, as Ellen White enjoined, on the ways the Lord has led and is teaching in our past history in this division, as you heard, the officers of the TED commissioned me to write a 40,000-word history, and I want to thank Rafat Kamal, Audrey Anderson, and Nenad Jeporanovic for entrusting that to me and for their support. And I'd also like to acknowledge Bertel Wicklander, who I think perhaps may have had the original idea, but I appreciate the support from the 3 executive officers of the TED. I also want to say what I have produced draws on research done by my staff. I'm indebted to my staff at the Office of Archive, Statistics and Research, and I want to particularly mention Ashley Chisholm, Benjamin Baker, and Michael Juncker. Research is not done alone or in a vacuum. Now, the concise history that will be published later this year is called A Passion for Mission, a title I adopted for reasons we'll come to in a moment. The book is not a history of the church in the territory of the TED, for that's a longer history. Adventist mission in Northern Europe began 5 decades before the NED was founded. So instead of being comprehensive, given the length, the 90th anniversary history is, as it must be, selective. It's an interpretation, not an all-inclusive narrative. And if that is true of the history from which this lecture is drawn, then how much truer must it be of this lecture, since I only have 50 minutes to do justice to 90 years? I want to stress that despite the partial, perhaps partisan, indeed probably provocative nature of what will follow, I hope it does more than provoke. I hope it prompts further and deeper reflection, not just about this division's history, but also about its trajectory. I hope that the lessons learned from the past can be applied to its future in order that we become more effective in carrying out the mission God has assigned to us. You know, as I'm an historian, I would study the past simply because I love it and it's worthwhile in its own right for me. But for Adventists, we don't study the past just in a dispassioned, detached way. We study it in order to make our mission more effective in the future. And I will warn you that there will be statistics. I'm actually contractually obliged to include graphs in every presentation I give. My title, Becoming European, may seem puzzling, and I suspect some of you are asking yourselves, hasn't the division always been European? Hasn't its chief goal always been to reach Europe with the distinctive Adventist message of wholeness and hope? Well, this division has had the word European in its title for most of its history, and it has always had a remarkable passion for mission. But for much of the TED's history, it included extra-European territories. And for many decades, the passion that Northern Europeans felt for mission was not focused primarily on their own territory. To a great extent, it was diverted to Africa, in particular, as well as in the 1980s and 1990s to parts of Asia. And I suggest that in ways we don't always recognize, the TED is still shaped by its long-standing association with Africa. It's shaped the lives of a number of you, as I look out, because you serve there. But I think in a more structural way, the TED is still shaped by that long association. But in light of that, another question some of you might be asking is, can we really say that this is the same division over all the 90 years? The title TED is, strictly speaking, actually the 6th designation. And I've put them all up on the screen. Having said that there are 6, though, one of them, the title North Atlantic Division, it held for less than 12 months in 1950. And 3 of the 6 usages are actually all Northern European Division. The title from 1929 to 49, then reinstated and continued until after North Atlantic, and that was a sort of mistake. And then it was continued till 1970, and then it was briefly restored in 1980 to 85. The other title used substantively was Northern Europe West Africa Division from 1970 to 1980. Regardless of change in nomenclature, there are 2 reasons for seeing this as the same division. The first is continuity in the divisional headquarters, not necessarily the location. That has changed. Initially, it was here at 41 Hazel Gardens, Edgware, Middlesex. Later, it was in Stockholm for a few years during the 40s, before returning in 1950 to Edgware, where it remained until on May Day 1966, it commenced operations in St. Albans. But the majority of the Adventist Church's world divisions have moved their headquarters at least once. The crucial point is that from NED to NUAD to TED, there has been complete institutional continuity at the division level. The same headquarters has guided Adventist work in the same group of countries around the North Sea and the Baltic Sea, plus a fluctuating collection of territories elsewhere, latterly in Europe's southeast, but originally in the wider world. So this brings us to the second continuity, in territory. While the maps of the TED today and the NED in 1929 are very different, at each change of title, the adjustment in territory was moderate. And let's just briefly look at, this shows the Northern European part of the Northern European Division in 1929 when the division was founded. It's not the whole division, we'll come back to that, but there it is. Those of you who are observant will note that the shape of Poland is different because the World War II came after that and things rather changed. This is the division in 1948. Those of you who are sharp-eyed will see it doesn't include the British Isles, but it now does include the Netherlands. 1966, the British are back, the Netherlands are still there, but you can start to see the West and East African territory. 1980, the last year of NUAD, You can see again, the North in Europe part and West Africa. Let's go to 1986, though, where for the first time Southeastern European territory gets added to the division, which is why the name changes from Northern European to Trans-European. In 1996, Middle East Union, actually in 1986, Pakistan was also part of the package. You can just see it inset there. 1996, the Middle East Union was added. But there has been a stable group of core countries. 6 nations have always been part of the division: Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway, Poland, and Sweden. But for 85 of the 90 years, the United Kingdom and the Republic of Ireland were also part of the division, and for the last 74 years it has included the Netherlands. The other countries have had shorter periods of belonging. Cyprus, nearly 24 years. Albania, Greece, Hungary, and the former Yugoslavia, the last 33 years. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, 36 years, and only the last 25, which is a shorter continuous period in the Balkans and Hungary, which have had the 33. But the Baltic Union was one of the Northern European Division's founding unions. After nearly 11 years, Soviet conquest separated the Baltic states for 5.5 decades before they were reunited with its original family in 1994. So it's probably fair to say, though, drawing on all that 9 nations, the British Isles, the 4 Nordic nations, the Netherlands, and, well, I'd include Iceland with that, let's make it 5, the Netherlands and Poland are the historic mission homelands of the Northern or Trans-European Division. And yet there were also African territories that were part of the division longer than some of the current countries. And they are further examples, actually, of the territorial continuity. For its first 14 years, this actually shows you the whole of the NED. Remember, I showed you Northern Europe first, but it also has vast territories in Africa. For its first 14 years, the NED administered Uganda and Kenya. It was responsible for Sudan and Somalia for more than 20 years each. They're not exactly at the same time. It had oversight of Ethiopia and Eritrea for 30 years, and it supervised Adventist mission in almost the whole of West Africa for just over half a century. Well over half the division's lifetime. I still remember, actually, the only GC session I'd attended before the last one was in 1980 when my parents attended and I went as a boy. And I can still remember discovering this strange beast called the Northern Europe-West Africa Division. And having grown up in Australia, I thought of Sesame Street, which may resonate with some of you and not others, but there's a little song that goes there that goes and says, one of these things is not like the other one. One of these things is not the same. How do these two belong? Northern Europe, West Africa. Even as a 10-year-old, you could sort of see it seems to be a little bit confusing. But in fact, NUAD was only used for 10 years. And in fact, the TED's title has been misleading for much of its history. This year is only the 8th year of its existence that it is exclusively European. So how did this come about? Well, in 1929, European empires ruled or dominated most of Africa and Asia. Seventh-day Adventist church structure reflected the age of imperialism. All 3 new divisions with European in their titles incorporated much of Africa, the whole Middle East, and parts of the Far East, with colonial territories assigned generally to the division of the respective imperial powers. This shows you the Southern European division. The cross-hatched sections, by the way, are the part that aren't in it. And so in Africa, you can see actually the NED's territory is cross-hatched, whereas in Europe, it's the Central European division. But so each of these had mission fields assigned, rather like empires. The Northern European division included Britain, and so British East and West Africa were assigned to the NED, along with quite a bit of French West Africa, as you can see there, because it had joined Ghana and Nigeria. The attachment of mission fields, especially in Africa, to nominally European divisions continued well into the 21st century, as most of you are aware, I think. The mission homelands of Europe were expected to support and actually did in practice successfully support the evangelization of Africa and parts of Asia. Now, I said the mission homelands. Instinctively, many Adventists would think of the United States as being the only Adventist homeland. But actually, as the church spread in the 19th century, others emerged. So in what sense can we speak of homelands in the TED? Well, first, Scandinavia and Britain received Adventist missionaries as early as the 1870s. The church starts in Denmark in 1877 when John Mattison, a Danish-American, returned to his homeland. Of course, he later worked in Norway as well as Denmark. John Loughborough arrived in England in 1878, beginning sustained Adventist work here. So the church in the British Isles and Scandinavia has deeper roots than the church anywhere except North America and Switzerland. And actually, the church grew much faster in Scandinavia than it did in Switzerland or Central Europe for the first 30 years. Later, Germany started to catch up. But Scandinavia really was one of the hubs of the world church. We'll come back to that. Not only is Adventism of long standing in Europe, but church organization developed here early too. The British Union Conference and the Scandinavian Union Conference, which had been founded in 1902 and 1901, they were essentially self-sustaining financially by the 1920s. Now, their self-dependence was sorely tried during the Great Depression and World War II, but in the post-war European economy, their finances, along with those of the the Netherlands and Finland unions, were well able to provide the funds necessary to sustain the church at home and to support missionaries and institutions abroad. So, in addition to these six, I would say these six homelands were largely self-sufficient in pastors and could provide training for those who felt called to the ministry. So this is why we can speak of them as a mission homeland. And second, of course, quite literally, it was in these unions that the homes of missionaries were found. From them, missionaries were recruited, trained, resourced, sent forth and sustained in the mission fields. When all this started, the homelands were also historic hotbeds of Protestantism. Adventism was established in a Christian stronghold. As we all know, things were to change. But a large part of the history of the TED has been the relationship of mission homelands to mission fields. And this is illustrated, actually, if we look at this chart, which graphs the division membership over 90 years. And what I think you will all immediately notice is these terrible troughs. So one might at first wonder about the effectiveness of the division. But this shows the membership each year in its iteration of the territory in the TED. It shows the membership report. So this chart isn't, I would say, entirely worthless. It's essentially meaningless for trying to gauge the overall growth of the division. What it does graphically and fairly accurately indicate, though, is how significant in the life of this division have been territories that are no longer part of it. And I would say that that's truer of this division than any other of the world divisions. We will come back before the end to see a chart showing membership in the current territories from 1929 to the present day, which means we'll compare like with like. But first, just to observe that the situation revealed here of considerable and ever-changing complexity is, as I say, truer of the TED than any division of comparable age. This division has historically experienced more and more sweeping changes in its territory and configuration than any other division. And that's in large part of its story. In fact, I would say that the NED and the TED has been the historic foster parent chosen by the world church for orphaned fields that, for whatever reason, didn't neatly fit into another division. This has actually been a service the TED has provided to the world church, though it's not really recognized. The TED's territories historically spanned from the icy climes of the Arctic Circle to the tropics, reaching from Greenland in the west to Pakistan in the east, from North Cape in Norway to the south of the equator in what is now Tanzania. It encompassed Zanzibar and Svalbard, Lake Tanganyika and Lake Ladoga, the Gulf of Guinea and the Gulf of Bothnia. The sheer geographical extent and the cultural variety of territories assigned to leaders from the British and Scandinavian homelands has been unmatched anywhere. To provide leadership to territories characterized by so great geographic, linguistic, and ethnic differences is inevitably demanding. It creates its own challenges beyond those that emerge from social or ecclesiastical contexts. And this is essential to understanding the history of this division. But it prompts, I think, a question: why has there been so much change? I think it largely speaks to the passion for mission that historically characterized the core heartlands in the NAD, now TED, and that motivated a long sequence of division officers and departmental directors of this division over the decades. When the European division was divided, its successors, the Northern European division ended up being allocated, as one church leader wrote at the time, by far the largest share of the old division's territory membership and mission responsibilities. The NED's mission interests, he wrote, in Africa were dispersed over a territory fully 5,000 miles from east to west and 2,000 miles from north to south. Some people would have actually thought that, this was insane. But the leaders of the NED did not. In fact, it was not chance that they had been given this territory. It was because they wanted it. They wanted the challenge. And that was true especially in the Scandinavian countries and the British Isles. They had this passion for mission. In 1906, the British Union Conference, acting independently, opened up the first mission in Kenya. In 1907, 2 Swedish missionaries sent by the Scandinavian Union Conference had entered Eritrea, intended as a first step to Ethiopia, which was eventually achieved by a Danish missionary in 1921. From the British Isles, 64 missionaries had gone overseas in the period 1907 to 1927, a fact of which British Adventists were rightly proud, as witnessed by this photographic celebration that they commissioned in 1927 or 28. It shows all of them, including the wives, who often get uncounted. According to Yvonne Oster's recent book, from 1892 through 1928, at least 26 missionaries went from Sweden. Denmark sent 36 missionaries to foreign countries just during the 1920s. At the end of its first year, the division officially counted 104 missionaries serving overseas in its mission fields, including the first 2 Latvian Adventists. And another 2 Latvians and an Estonian followed within 3 years. So now we were extending from Scandinavia and the Britain to include the whole of the Union as a source for missionaries. The new division's leaders declared at their first winter council, "We pledge ourselves under God to make every effort to carry the Adventist message to the many millions in the countries of the Northern European division, including its large mission fields." They sounded a clarion call for mission to the many millions in the fields where our work is represented. The unwarned millions make their pathetic appeal, and in view of the nearness of the coming of Jesus, we must certainly lay plans for a larger work. These are statistics and sentiments that could be repeated today, I think, even if we worded them a little differently. The passion for mission continued for at least the next 70 years, and I think into the 21st century. In Heirs to the Reformation, published in 1997, the late Hugh Dunton, Dennis Porter, and Ronald Strazdowski identified a minimum of 635 missionaries who in the previous 100 years had gone as long-term foreign missionaries, and that's just from the territories of the TED. They also identified many others from other European countries. So remember, 104 missionaries serving overseas by the end of 1929. According to this one study, 635 up to 1997. And that's not counting student missionaries and short-term volunteers. But actually, I think that 635 figure is certainly too low. GC Secretariat's figures on the division of origin are incomplete, but they show 523 new missionaries sent out from this division in 23 years of the 56 years between 1958 to 2013. 523. It's likely that the TED's total of long-term missionaries since the beginning of the last century approaches 1,000, with the bulk of them sent after the creation of this division. That's an extraordinary story. So a large part of the history of the TED is missionary history. What did this actually entail? Up to World War II, it could be highly dangerous, though not as much as it had been up to the early 1920s, when West Africa was known as the white man's graveyard, and for good reason. But even in the 30s and 40s, there were considerable sacrifices to be made by those who went as missionaries, even if they did not have to lay down their lives. Up to the 1970s, the missionaries very often gave up their lives in the sense of giving many decades of their lives to the mission field and of giving up both the material comforts of Europe and the emotional and spiritual comforts of being close to family and friends. That hundreds of Adventists from this division made these sacrifices, paying the price and doing so willingly, even gladly, is something that we ought not to forget. But being a missionary also involved learning to adapt to cultures that were often dramatically different. And this too, European missionaries did enthusiastically. And it's worth pausing for a moment here because this runs counter to the assumptions of most Europeans today. There is a cliche in modern Europe and America of the missionary as a white man clad in khaki drill or perhaps white linen with a white pith helmet, cutting his way through the jungle with a machete, suffering malarial fevers, fighting off crocodiles or the odd hippo, before finally arriving at a native village. Assured of his personal superiority, supremely confident in his own abilities, certain of Western moral, theological, and technological rectitude, the missionary confronts the natives with the gospel of Western culture, condemning their pagan behaviors and beliefs. He never doubts that he has nothing to learn and everything to teach. He is a figure of terrible anger and smug hypocrisy, of awful self-righteousness and sweeping self-confidence, seeking to abolish traditional attitudes and ancient customs, thanks to a formidable range of ingrained cultural assumptions and powerful biases, all disguised by the rhetoric of Christianizing and civilizing. The missionary never doubts that he is the man, and they usually are men. He is there to get the natives to abandon nakedness, make the women put on blouses, the men put on shorts, or better yet, trousers. And most ominously, he's really there to get the savages to accept imperial government and economic exploitation. Well, the truth is, this purportedly unbiased view of the missionary is fruit of a prejudice as powerful as any held by supposedly bigoted missionaries. There were missionaries who equated the gospel with Western culture or commerce, or indeed with male and female fashion. But there were others who resisted imperialism, who educated, empowered, and enabled the people they worked for and with to improve their lot and cast off colonial rule. And this was perhaps particularly true of Seventh-day Adventist missionaries because of the Adventist emphasis on education and public health. As to the machetes, the pith helmets, the suits, there's a certain degree of truth to this perception, including for Adventist missionaries in Europe. Here we see William Spicer, GC president. It's in South Africa, not an NED territory, but, you know, the pith helmet is there. And this is Irwin Evans, former GC treasurer, long-term vice president, pictured in Uganda in 1935 with two local chieftains. He doesn't have the white suit, but he does have white shoes, which I think is a fashion solecism with a dark suit, but we'll let that go. But as to the rest of these perceptions, they are simply not a recognizable picture of most Adventist missionaries, and especially those from Europe. What is striking is how many Adventist missionaries from this division were forward-looking, open-minded, and well aware that they could learn from their local hosts. Despite inevitable diversity between different places and different times, there are, I think, sufficient commonalities and continuities that we can speak of a collective TED approach to mission. And I would say it was characterized by considerable willingness to adapt the Adventist message to local contexts, communicating the three angels' messages in local languages, both literally and figuratively, both verbally and conceptually. This was true of individual missionaries on the ground in mission stations such as Aba and Orton, Agona and Korafodua, Kireka and Kokoro, Wallo and Walega. But it was also true, to a degree some might find remarkable, of the division leaders in London, Stockholm and St. Albans. They recognized, as early as mission leaders in Ibadan, Nairobi, and Addis Ababa, that the institutional church, as well as individual missionaries, had to adapt to different cultures, and that the division had to provide support to enable contextualization at the basic level. Church leaders in Northern Europe invested time and money in providing excellent idiomatic translations in as many languages as possible. They wouldn't be satisfied with just one language of a country. In Nigeria, for example, they start with Igbo, they quickly move on to Yoruba, and then they also try to go into other languages as well. And this throws up interesting questions. How does one interpret or translate God the Father, for example, to Nigerian peoples, tribal groups for whom the senior male relative is the father's brother rather than the actual father? This kind of work required thought, sensitivity, experience in the field, and mental flexibility. Did missionaries and church leaders from TED always get things right? No. But they tried very hard, and often with considerable success. And the huge commitment of personnel, finances, and intellectual resources had an impact that was immense. In 1929, 3,202 of the NED's 24,228 members, just 13.2%, were in the division's mission fields in Africa. By 1980, when the West African territories of NUAD were detached and the division renamed NED, 87,389 of its 128,500 baptized members, 68%, were in the two West African unions, each of which had more members than the division's 6 European unions put together. Meanwhile, the passing decades brought independence to what had once been colonies and recurrent surges of emigration from them to the countries whose empires they had belonged to, creating ethnic diversity in what were once largely monochrome societies. Despite that influx, population growth in Europe has slowed in the last 90 years. One result is that whereas in 1929 Europeans were 1 in 3 of the global population, today they're 1 in 10. And the figures for Seventh-day Adventist church members are even more striking. In 1928, there were approximately 80,000 European Adventists, comprising 32% of the global membership, equivalent to 80% of the membership in the North American division. Now, the membership has grown. There are now 370,000 members in Europe in all the divisions. But the equivalent figures are 1.8% of the reported world membership and 30% of membership in North America. The 22,000 church members, which in 1929 were in the TED's 2019 territories. Do you follow me when I say that? So just trying to compare like with like. In 1929, in the TED's 2019 territories, there were 22,000 members, which were 8% of the global membership. And though the number of church members has increased fourfold, 90 years on, the TED's nearly 90,000 members are 0.4% of world reported membership. Now, some might see this as something to be regretted, and I think in one sense it is because it reflects the relative decline of Christianity in Europe, in what had once been Christendom. And that's a phenomenon that affects all denominations, not only Seventh-day Adventists. However, even though one wishes that Europeans were much more receptive to the third angel's message, the transformation of the Adventist church in Africa was wonderful. It was a matter of growth of the church in terms of members, but also its growth in the sense of maturing. There are now Adventist universities and colleges spread across East and West Africa, where once there were only a few basic mission schools. Once African countries needed foreign missionaries to act as ministers and administrators. And in fact, if you go through the records of the Northern European Division Committee, they're sending cooks as missionaries to hospitals in Africa and secretaries because there aren't any Adventists. Well, now they don't even need to send ministers and administrators. Now missionaries are typically used only in medical and highly technical positions. So this numerical, educational, and administrative self-sufficiency in Africa is something that was a goal of the early missionaries. Men and women like William Bartlett, Reuben and Hannah Bergstrom, Jesse and Catherine Clifford, Gunnar and Marit Gudmundsson, Conrad Hyde and John Jacob Hyde, and a bunch of other Hydes, Per Lindgren, William McClements, Spencer Maxwell, Amanda Nuka, Valdemar Toppenberg, and many others. Were they still alive, they would be praising God for what has been achieved by this division in Africa. But here's a troubling thought. The extraordinary flourishing of the church in Ethiopia, Kenya, Uganda, South Sudan, Sierra Leone, Ghana, Nigeria, and Cameroon, all of which initially were, and in some cases for several decades remained, under the NED or TED. That was due in large part to a massive injection of people and money from Northern Europe. Was the outflow of resources to Africa too much for the good of the church back in the core countries of the TED? Did the prominence given to converting the heathen mean too little emphasis was given to evangelizing Europeans? Did church growth in the African mission fields come at the expense of church growth in the mission homelands? I doubt one could reach a definite conclusion. One would have to take into account positive influences on the church in the homelands of this considerable effort. And the evidence is often indeterminate. But this disquieting question, or rather these disquieting questions, at least have to be considered. Here's another question. Was as much time, effort, and money put into translating Adventism into the cultural idiom of Northern Europe as it was into contextualizing in Nigeria or Somalia, Uganda or Ghana? I remember Peter Röhnfeldt, when he was ministerial secretary of the TED, liked to speak about Adventism learning to speak the language of Europe. And he didn't mean the languages. He meant cultural adaptation. This was done with great success in West Africa in particular. It was probably attempted less and less successfully in the Middle East and Pakistan. Is it possible that as Europe has grown less and less Christian, so that American ideas and methodologies are less and less likely to work here, the organized institutional church has not invested as much as it might have, even as much as it ought to have, in the homelands, in the kinds of exercise it engaged in with distinction in the mission fields? Having noted earlier how the most significant changes often emanated from outside the division, from the world church saying, please take responsibility for this, and division leaders saying, yes, we will. In recent years, it has been internal trends that are the most striking, and these are partly illustrated by statistics. This shows the trend in Adventist membership in select nations and unions from 1929 and to the present day. And you can see I've singled out here, again, these sort of the 9 countries that are the homelands. Great Britain and Ireland are combined. Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and Finland, which were part of one union, are not now, so we separate them out. The Baltics are all put in together as one, but you can see, I think, the rationale. And you can see the membership grow by decades. And I realize this is a somewhat complicated chart, but there we go. You can see here the growth by decades, 1930, 1940, 50, and all the way up to 2018. And you can see the dramatic growth in membership, in particular in Great Britain. And you can see that in some of the Scandinavian or Nordic unions, there's actually negative growth. This shows church members per 1,000 people. So it shows not the raw net numbers, it shows them as a proportion to the wider population. Again, for the select unions or countries, and again by decade. And actually here the really striking standout is Norway. In terms not of the actual membership, but as a proportion of the population, Norway is the outlier in the early years. And you can also see, though, the significance of Denmark. But then we start to see the decline in the early 2000s. In considering the history of the Northern European division, a significant trend is that the northernmost parts of the division are becoming proportionately less significant. The balance of membership between different unions and countries with their different cultures can affect how the division does business. who becomes its leaders, their modus operandi in dealing with the component unions, how they relate to the General Conference, the role that leaders from across the division play in world church decision-making processes. So the statistics here are highlighting a development of historic significance and a trend that can shape the division's future. The major development in the last 3 decades has undoubtedly, and it is just the last 3 decades, has undoubtedly been the growth in both absolute and relative terms of the British Church. From not quite 4,500 members when the NED started to a fraction under 14,000 and its golden jubilee year of 1979, and now 40 years on, approaching 40,000. In the first half century, British membership increased 300%, but that's from a low base. It's easy to get dramatic growth from a low base. I think the 120% growth they've had in the last 4 decades is in some ways more impressive. It actually represents 525 additional members per year, as opposed to 260 per year in the preceding 5 decades. But equally significant is the BUC's share of division membership. As you'll see, it was 20% in 1929. It actually declined to 11% 50 years later, but that was distorted by the dramatic and disproportionate growth in the West African mission fields that we talked about a moment ago, so that when they left, or rather just before they left, the European membership was sort of suppressed. Once they left, well, in 1989, the BUC had 26% of TED's members, slightly higher than in 1929, but not a lot. Yet it now is 44%, more than doubling its share of division membership since the NED was founded, and that is a dramatic demographic geographical shift. Furthermore, the BUC's share of tithe rose from 36.3% in 1929 to 48.4% last year. British members gave 1/3 of the division's first mission offering. By 2018, their contribution had risen to 46.6%, and in all, 48.1% of the TED's total tithes and offerings last year were returned or given in the British Union. But this represents a very dramatic shift in the division's center of gravity. Of its original 6 unions, the Scandinavian Union Conference was not just the largest, it had more members than the second and third largest unions, the British and Baltic Union conferences, put together. In 1929, the Scandinavian Union's share of tithe was 44.33%, and of mission offerings, 40%. By 2018, of course, the Scandinavian Union no longer exists, but taking the 4 countries, the combined share of the 4 unions that had been conferences of the Scandinavian Union was down to 24.6% of tithes and 17% of mission offerings. The shift has been away not only from Scandinavia in general, but from Denmark in particular. I'm not trying to single anyone out here, Thomas. I find these trends interesting from an historical point of view, because Denmark was where Adventist history began in the TED. More, it was the historical hub of the Scandinavian Union Conference and then really of the Northern European Division. That was partly due to the role of Skodsborg, which formed the heart of a network of allied philanthropies, which is the description of one GC official trying to make sense of them. Denmark's pivotal role is especially evident in statistics. Today, of the 4 countries that constituted the old Scandinavian Union, Finland has the largest membership, Norway the second largest, and it's the biggest financial contributor, but together they amount to 10% of the total TED membership. In contrast, there's Skodsborg in 1910. So that's the 2 largest unions from Scandinavia are 10% of the total TED membership. In contrast, in January 1929, the Denmark Conference was 11% of the division membership. It had a larger membership than the East African, Ethiopian, or Polish unions and the combined West African mission fields, which were not yet unions. Denmark's share of the division tithe was 16.6%. Danes gave 14.25% of the mission offering, and just this one conference was the source of 12% of all tithes and offerings in the division. In 2019, the Danish Union of Churches has 2.75% of the division membership. So in sum, whereas the Scandinavian Union initially, and then for decades the East Nordic Union and the West Nordic Union, these were the engines that drove the NED and then the TED. But those days seem to have passed. Paradoxically, their influence is preserved in the division's ecclesiastical polity because 4 conferences eventually became 4 unions. Perhaps one of the issues future leaders will need to resolve are the weight that ought to be given to denominational membership and resources as opposed to missional need. Which should be more important in a church structure? The population of church members to be served, that's what some people would say, or the wider population to be reached? I don't know the answer to that question. I suspect it will vary according to circumstances. But whatever one's perspective, the trajectory in the TED is away from its historical heartland in Scandinavia. And that heightens the need for the issues to be studied, discussed, and addressed. And yet at the same time, we have seen that the trajectory of the TED as a whole is back to its homeland. The organization and conceptual model that indelibly molded the division was of a homeland responsible for distant mission fields. This model took structural shape, yet it also took mental and cultural forms. I think it transcended a mere template and approached an archetype. Its influence was especially evident in administration, finances, governance, and representation, the external trappings of ecclesiastical organization. But it was also internalized. It shaped the imagination of generations of Adventists dispersed widely across Europe, but sharing a common passion for mission. That pattern endured for half a century, and overall it's characterized 77 of the TED's 90 years, because it was restored in revised form in 1985, after which the location of the mission fields changed, but not the nature of the dynamic. In 2011, though, the mold was broken. It is unlikely to be recast. To generalize across the 9 decades of the division's history, the TED's raison d'etre was to mobilize the time, talents, and money of Adventists in its northern homelands and deploy them to its African appendages. I don't think that's ever how it would have been stated. In principle, financial and personnel assets were also to be applied to evangelizing the regions that supplied most of the resources. But there was a prevailing assumption that Europe was already Christian. The urgent necessity seemed to be to reach the nation's tribes and peoples who had never heard the gospel, much less distinctive Adventist doctrines. The romance of the mission field, the pathos of those unwarned millions, and perhaps the fact that ultimately mission was rather more successful in what was supposedly the dark continent than in what had once been Christendom. All this actually helped to confuse the issue of what was core and what was peripheral in the trans-European division. When the energies and assets of the core territory, the homeland, were being largely applied to the apparently marginal mission fields, which region really took precedence? Power lay principally in Britain and Scandinavia, but the needs of Africa set the agenda. At first, of course, that meant the wants of European leaders in Africa, but gradually national leadership took over, and yet they continued to request and to receive missionaries and money. The upshot was to turn the mental world of Adventists in Europe upside down, because the church grew rapidly in the pagan periphery while it plateaued in the homelands. And today, instead of mission being something done by or from Europe to Africa, the Caribbean, and Asia, increasingly East and West Africans and West Indians make a significant contribution to the church in the Netherlands and the United Kingdom. And they're playing their part too in Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. I suggest that in some ways the attitudes and thinking of the days when the division was known as Ned, Nuad, and well, Ned again, linger in Ted today. And yet, at the same time, the youngest members in the TED have little or no idea of the heritage of missional involvement in Africa and beyond. In 1937, a Danish author, Karen Blixen, published Out of Africa, her memoir of 17 years living in Kenya, then the British colony of British East Africa. Blixen believed she had settled there permanently, but in the end she returned to her homeland. The book was a bestseller and made into an Academy Award-winning movie. I suspect quite a number of you have seen that. In some ways, perhaps it could stand for the history of the NED and the TED. The gradual trajectory has been out of Africa. The division was always European, of course, in some sense, but its energies and resources were constantly being directed to Africa. It seemed that the Danes and the Britons, Norwegians, Swedes, and others were in Africa to stay. But in the end, the control of the African Adventist Church by paternalistic authorities 8,000 miles away proved to be fleeting, like the British and French colonization of African lands. There was an imperial Adventist moment, but it passed. Today, Europe's Adventists have to adjust mentally to the fact that they are out of Africa. Even as many African church members are literally going out of Africa, emigrating to Europe. But it's not easy to shake off 77 years of history. Perhaps there's still a sense among some of the older generation that deference is due to the old homelands, even to the old heartlands. As church members move into Europe in the TED, in fact, as they move within Europe, between the TED's far-flung territories which extend from Karelia and Cyprus to Ireland and Iceland, as they move, these Adventist immigrants may need to be more sensitive to the cultural context of their new homes. If they are serious about converting majority populations, they will need to adjust. In fact, they will need to make a conscious effort in the way that missionaries from Northern Europe made an effort to adjust to the cultural setting of the one-time mission fields. Here are two more disquieting questions, I fear even provocative ones, but I think they need to be asked. Are European Adventists in the early 21st century able to adjust to the historic shifts? And will those same Adventists, themselves postmodern to a great degree already, drawn from a range of different ethnicities and cultures, including many members of African descent, and drawn too from territories so geographically, culturally, and linguistically diverse as to be almost bewildering, will they be able to work together effectively to evangelize Europe as their forefathers and foremothers once did tropical Africa? I think at its crux, the challenge is whether the trans-European division can now simply be European. Nevertheless, having highlighted challenges, I want to stress a really very simple point about success. Because the bottom line is that in the face of extreme secularism and absolute indifference to religion is probably more difficult to overcome than hostility. In the face of that, the Seventh-day Adventist Church survives, and it is starting to find ways to thrive in the territory of the TED. There is a church presence here today because of the fidelity and fortitude of generations of Adventists who, in the face of the vicissitudes of depression and recession, of World War and Cold War, of theological controversies, of persecution, pluralism, parochialism, and postmodernism, who, in the face of these enormous obstacles, kept the flame alive in Europe and took it to much of the rest of the world. In 1901, when the Scandinavian Union Conference was organized, the first union formed in the TED's territory, there were just over 4,000 Adventists in Europe, and Rafat has mentioned these, but we'll draw to a conclusion with them. That meant that there was one Adventist for every 62,600 Europeans. When the European division was split into four, the ratio had improved to 4,750 to 1. But if one looks at the figures for 1929 in the TED's current territory again, there were 22,400 church members and a general population of 165 million. So the ratio was 7,365 to 1. Worse in Europe than in Europe as a whole, but immensely improved on 1901. Today's 88,100 church members in the TED are a fraction of the total population, estimated by demographers at some 206 million. The ratio is approximately 2,340 to 1. And yet, you could look at that and just be discouraged, and yet, that means that there are 42 Adventists per 100,000 people in the TED now. Look at the trend. 62,000 to 1, 7,500 to 1, 2,300 to 1. The ratio has improved by a factor of 2 since 1929. And if we calculate it as Adventists per 100,000 people, You can see there was 1.5 in 1901 when the Scandinavian Union was organized. It was 13.5 in 1929 when this division was founded. And in this division now, not the whole of Europe, in this division now, it's 42 per 100,000. The share is 250% of what it was when the division was founded. And what that means is that the church has not only grown, it has grown faster than the population at large. That's an immensely encouraging statistic. We have colleagues in certain parts of the world who would look at these and not be very impressed, but we're not living in their parts of the world. And you see here the increase in the share from 1929 to 2019. As I say, I think this is a very encouraging statistic. But here's a final slide. I showed you the reported membership of this division, which of course is dramatically affected by the huge changes in territory. This shows the trend in the TED's membership calculated based on its current territorial configuration. As I said, simply graphing the membership reported by the division starting in 1929 is not very meaningful, so we have assembled the statistics for all the 29 nations and autonomous regions that make up the TED today, regardless of their divisional affiliation in the past. This shows the real growth of the church of today's trans-European division. Growth has been slow at times, but it has been steady. If there is no room for complacency, certainly there is room for some satisfaction. The third angel's message has taken root in European soil. That's what I see in these statistics. If we take all the statistics we reviewed, they are troubling in many ways, but they reveal that the Seventh-day Adventist Church in this division and in Europe as a whole has staying power. Much of the credit must go to church members, of course, to pastors and elders, but some of the credit, perhaps quite a lot of the credit, is due to the division leadership that has provided direction from London and St. Albans and briefly Stockholm for 90 years. In closing, what can we take from the past and apply to the future? In the face of great difficulty, some European Adventists are reduced to despondency, or worse, I think, to introspection. We turn inwards, forget about the mission we've been given. But I think perhaps future historians, instead of concluding that this division's best days were decades ago, will find them in days that still lie ahead of us. That could happen, I believe, if we could apply some lessons from our history. It could happen if Seventh-day Adventists in this division can concentrate on their connection with Christ. If they take pride in their extraordinary record of missionary service in Africa and Asia and be inspired by it without letting it define them. If they focus their energies on becoming as fluent in the cultural idioms of Europe as in its linguistic tongues and dialects. If they can recognize and accept the shifts that have taken place both in the world church and within the division. And if they will work with the church as it now is. If they are willing to move on from the power structures, mental topographies, and evangelistic methodologies of a past century, and if they will remember and reignite their traditional passion for mission. If, in fact, the division officers, church members of the Trans-European Division will now truly focus our energies on being European, there will be no need for gloom. For realism, yes, but not for despair. Unquestionably, there will be more obstacles to come and to overcome. But by God's grace and by building thoughtfully on our past, we can press boldly into the future.